Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Yacht Crew Blogs right here on Yachting International Radio. My name is Ria. I am your host, and today I am pleased to introduce Andy Ridley, the CEO of Citizens of the Great Barrier Reef. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good. Well, it's really lovely to have you on here. I mean, something that for quite a few years now, actually, that has been talked about is the Great Barrier Reef and the fact that it has been experiencing some catastrophic change as a result of the change in our planet and the way we are treating it. You are launching something today. What is that?
Yeah, so we're launching a pretty massive project called the Great Reef Census, and what we're trying to do is get very large scale reconnaissance images from across as much of the Great Barrier Reef as is possible. So, the reef is massive. It's 2,300 kilometers long. It's same sort of size and area as Germany. So a very large amount of the reef has not been surveyed. Like 40% of it's never been surveyed from an environmental or conservation perspective. And then in the last sort of 10 years, you'd say less than 10%. Of the last year, you'd probably say less than 1%. So getting really up-to-date reconnaissance data, as they call it, from as broad a part of the reef as possible is really really useful for those trying to manage it and for thinking about the long-term management of the reef.
What are the challenges that the reef is experiencing at the moment? I mean, I know there has been 3 mass bleaching events in the past 5 years. What are the challenges that the reef is facing at this moment?
Well, as you sort of mentioned, we had those 2 big sequential bleachings in 2016 and 2017, and then a kind of a broader one, but with less mortality, last year. But the story of the reef is really nuanced. It's a real patchwork of across the whole system. There are still extraordinary, amazing places across that reef, and there's places that have been impacted by climate or by crown of thorns starfish or by runoff from the land. But it's like, it's often never kind of, people look for a sort of black and white, is it dead or is it alive? And it's very, very much alive, but it's very much under threat at the same time.
What does it mean when you say bleaching?
Well, this is when the coral is essentially affected by the warming temperatures. So it could be there's multiple parts to bleaching, but essentially the reef, the coral gets highly stressed by the warm temperatures, and it can recover, but it can also die. So if you get mass bleaching, as I said, this year we had mass bleaching across the reef, but the mortality rate was not anywhere near as high as in 2016 or 2017, which was a bit more concentrated. So often it's how long does the heat last? And there's more aspects to it than that, but simply put, it's kind of that.
How can we as people help the Great Barrier Reef in general?
Well, I mean, as I said, the greatest threat to the reef is climate change. But I've also, think we should sort of recognize there's this idea that we have this sort of black and white image sometimes of the reef, and this idea that it's dead or alive. And as simply as that. And it really is a case of now is the decade, now is the time, now is the year where we can start to really reverse the story of decline, and that all comes down to emissions. The project, the Great Reef Census, though, is really about utilizing every asset on the reef to try and get that kind of important data back to those who are managing it and to the scientists trying to work out what we're going to do to build resilience over the next decade or two as we try and bring emissions down globally. And so what we've done with the Great Reef Census is exactly that. We're trying to utilize every boat we can get our hands on. So whether that's a research vessel, it's tourism boats, it's liverboards, it's charter vessels, it's island operations where you might have tourism things going on, and try and utilize as many of those boats as possible to survey as much of the reef as we can. And this year it's a bit of it's a big trial of this methodology, but we're confident that we'll reach some very remote parts of the reef, far up in the north and far down in the south in places like the Swains. And then a really interesting second part to it is that if you're keen to help, you can get on greatreefcensus.org and sign up there, and we're going to ask you to help us with some citizen science. So it's very simple. We're going to ask for help for lots of people all over the world to analyze some of the images that we're bringing back. And we've done that in a way that you actually have to have, you don't have to have experience of working in marine biology to do this. It's a really simple piece of analysis. And that feeds into the machine learning efforts of organizations like the Australian Institute for Marine Science. So it helps us improve the technology that's working on the reef.
So what you're asking people to do then is to not only photograph, but as well then help to analyze afterwards.
Yeah, so this year, because of Corona, there's we would normally be trying to mobilize en masse the tourism industry and the dive industry. It's a lot. There's a lot less going on this year, obviously on the reef, because everyone's is shut down and the borders are closed and that kind of stuff. But we're still really making sure that the local community, those who work on the reef on a daily basis, are a big part of collecting the data, which is, as you say, is photographs. But the bit that you can do wherever you are in the world, doesn't matter if you're in London or New York or Cape Town or Beijing, is help with the analysis of those images. And we're really interested to see, what is the participation on that? It's very simple citizen science, but it is almost like a test model to see, well, people obviously care about the Great Barrier Reef and reefs around the world, but do they care enough to, hop on and try and help us?
Do you think that that simple act of them jumping on board and doing a tiny little part may make them think overall about their effect on the environment?
Look, I think we are rapidly reaching a point where we understand that to deal with the environmental challenges that face us now, we are going to have to rethink how we do conservation. And fundamentally, we have to find ways of scaling up. And so whilst money is a key component to that, it's also going to involve, a more 21st century way of engaging people all around the world and assets around the world to help. And I think that Great Reef Census is really an endeavor to do that. It will take everyone to participate in order to, in terms of broadly conservation, in order to get the kind of scale of change that we need. So, in a way, Great Reef Census and Citizens, the organisation that I'm part of, is all about that 21st century conservation approach. More of a shared economy approach or a circular economy approach than maybe the traditional model.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, through the lockdowns and the beginning, back in March, April, May, we were seeing reports straight across the face of the planet of some amazing changes within the environment the minute that us human population were not allowed to interfere with nature. Did you see any changes whatsoever in the Great Barrier Reef or?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the thing with the reef, the Great Barrier Reef, is that only about at a maximum about 5% of it is sort of relatively regularly visited. It's so big. I mean, people know it's big, but trying to get your head around how big this place is quite difficult. So in a way, you would. I'm sure there are some effects you would have spotted from a reduction in tourism. But the reality of it is that tourism is really, really, really small in terms of the area that it actually affects. I think probably the biggest maybe lesson or the biggest effect you'd have on the Great Barrier Reef is a much broader one, which is, many of the times we've sort of been looking at, well, what do we need to do in order to deal with climate change or to deal with environmental issues? And often the argument's made that, to do that would cost money. And, there hasn't necessarily been the willing to act on a scale that is required to deal with things like climate change. It's very incremental. I think the quite compelling part to the tragedy of Corona is that when humanity decided it needed to deal with it, barring a few countries, it did prove that we can turn a global economy on its head on a massive level if we have to. And I think the ask for something like climate change, the ask for dealing with the environmental issues that we really need to deal with particularly over the next, decade. And I don't mean leave it for 10 years and then do it. I mean, starting really on an exponential growth to change, right now. I mean, humanity's proved it can do it. And it wouldn't be anywhere near as devastating or destructive as having to deal with corona. So I think that's a really interesting thing to show, humanity has, and it has historically shown this, whether you're looking at things like, dealing with, world wars and stuff like that. It has historically shown humanity has shown a capacity to change when it needs to. Often it leaves it till the last minute, though.
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with greed, really. We talk a lot about money, and people are afraid of losing their incomes. They're afraid of losing, ultimately their money. But we're not looking. It's not just the Great Barrier Reef that's affected. It is the planet as a whole. We're talking about someday our ability to grow food. It's our waterways. It's just basically everything straight across the board, unless we start paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, the thing about the Great Barrier Reef is, this is one of the best managed reefs on the planet. And, it's on the edge of a country with, a globally, top 20 economy kind of thing. And, and yet we still struggle to find its value sometimes. And there's obviously the value. One of the other things I think has happened this year is, there is it feels like there is a greater appreciation for nature. I think if you end up being locked down in a city like Melbourne or London or anywhere on the planet, really, you really miss the outdoors. And so these places are important from a kind of humanity survival perspective, but they're important from a spiritual perspective, from an aesthetic perspective, from so many different levels, let alone obviously the biodiversity and all of those very obvious things. But I mean, again, I feel for all the tragedy of corona, we should find inspiration in that capacity of humanity to react when it chooses to do so. And that should we should remind us that if we so does our deal with these issues that sit right in front of us right now.
Wise words. We're going to make sure that we provide all of the information for those around the world that are watching this interview. If they want to participate, if they're going to be out on their boats and they want to help take pictures, and if you are in somewhere like Beijing or in Alaska and you want to help with the data, you'll be able to do that as well. So everybody on the face of the planet can feel like they are part of the Great Barrier Reef and helping in this very important thing. Because as you said, I mean, we're not just talking about the next 6 months, we're talking about the next decade and the decade after and the decade after.
That's right. And I should sort of add that the idea of Great Reef Census this year is we're going to try and get to at least 150 reefs, which would still be, that is still an enormous amount for us to try and reach. Next year, our hope is that we'll be able to scale that up again and get to closer to 500 reefs. So you've got this kind of annual ability to do reconnaissances across as much of the reef as possible. But the intent beyond that is to open source the technology, the platform, and how we approach that. So reef communities all over the world can do their own Great Reef Census, and we start to get that kind of global picture of what's going on. And we actually, there's a lot of duplication in conservation, both marine and land. We are a generation that, again, we have, for the problems that we face, there are also incredible opportunities that digitization of the planet offers us in terms of sharing knowledge, sharing what we've learned, what we've got right, what we've got wrong, and using data in a way that is really valuable. So thinking to the future and where we could go, that need to work together, but for the first time, probably the capacity to work together, are all there for the taking if, again, we choose to do so. So yeah, if you want to get involved, whether you're an individual or a boat owner or or work for a business or a government that can help, then it is one of those moments where we need help, and it would be most welcome.
Is there a way people can help financially as well?
Yeah, look, I mean, we've raised as with all these things, it's a struggle to get initial investment in them. But we've actually done a really good job this year, a tough job actually, given the circumstance, in raising enough money to run this year's trial, and we've raised about 20% of the funds we need to scale it up again next year. There's some really good organisations getting involved with this, from the Prior Foundation in Melbourne to the Great Barrier Reef Foundation down in Brisbane, who are lending hands, and technology companies. All sorts of people are getting involved, but the biggest one is really the boat owners themselves, who are already really helping. But yeah, no, we need a lot of help, and if we're to reach that dream of being able to open source the whole thing, so that communities with less money than us can utilize it, then yeah, the funding is always very welcome and very needed. But unusually in conservation, I think you can actually really see a tangible benefit to it as well. And it is critical to get the funding, but it's also critical to get the other resources required to do something like this. And it's also critical to get an attitude that's about, like, let's make this happen, and let's, take this first part of the journey and then expand and see what else we can do once you mobilize, hopefully, many, many people around the planet.
Well, I think if we all come together and do just a little bit for the planet, we would be awfully surprised at the results.
Yeah, so true.
It doesn't take, we don't have to become militant, and I think that's a mistake that some people make a lot of the times, is they think that they're going to have to go 100% all in, and that'd be great if we could, but realistically, if everyone did their little bit, even just recycling plastic, or just a tiny bit, it doesn't have to impact your entire daily life, but if everyone did that little something, what an amazing change we would see.
Actually, I think it's there's a real moment now about getting practical.
Yeah.
And of course, if you're an individual, what you do with plastic makes a difference. And when you think about that, when it's billions of people, it makes a massive difference. It makes a fundamental difference. But everything's scalable, So if you're a CEO of a company, and what you do with that company, what you do with the influence you have as a CEO, that can be game changing. What direction you give in terms of innovation, and the direction you want to go as a brand, or as a that all makes a difference. And I think with sensors particularly, but with the Great Reef, with Citizens of the Great Barrier Reef in general, we're trying to build essentially a reef cooperative, a group of organizations with a shared view that we can do something about the conservation and preservation of the Great Barrier Reef and reefs around the world. And maybe we can build a model that's not just about marine conservation, but can be used in a almost less difficult environment, being on land. It's actually, a lot of the methodology is similar. You think about how you structure an organization in the 21st century. There are many ways that are comparable with commercial business, shared economy, the Ubers of the world, etc., and how we could apply almost the same thinking to scaling up conservation around the planet.
Wonderful, well, Andy. I really appreciate your time and you talking to us about this. And as I said, it's launching today, so I would suggest everybody goes to the links that are down below this interview. If you can do your part, whether it be financial, whether it be with photographs and documentation, or whether it be from the data side of things. I mean, there's many ways you can get involved, and it's, once again, just do one little part, and it can make such a big difference. So thank you again, Andy, the CEO of Citizens of the Great Barrier Reef. Yeah, it was wonderful to have you on, and we'll have to have you back on again in a few months and see where things are going, and how far you've gotten ahead, and what other pleas you may need.
Lovely. Thanks for your time.
You've been watching another edition of Yacht Vlogs right here on Yachting International Radio. My name is Ria. I have been your host. Tune in again for another episode.